Ethan Vale had promised his sister, Madison Hale, that he would try to socialize more, though the idea rarely appealed to him. He preferred quiet evenings, familiar routines, and predictable environments. Yet on that brisk autumn evening, he found himself standing at the door of Rowan and Julian Carter's house, trying to convince himself that stepping inside was a reasonable decision. Madison had insisted the gathering would be small and relaxed, and Ethan trusted her judgment enough to give it a chance. Rowan greeted them first. She was warm in a way that felt practiced, not fake, but refined by years of hosting and smoothing edges for others. Her smile reached her eyes, but those same eyes held a subtle heaviness Ethan couldn't quite place. She ushered them inside with a gentle enthusiasm, complimenting Madison's new coat and thanking Ethan for finally accepting an invitation. The house itself radiated calm, soft lamplight, muted earth tones, and the faint scent of sandalwood lingering in the air. Julian Carter appeared near the archway leading to the living room. His posture was straight, his expression calm, yet something about him made Ethan instinctively attentive. He had the kind of presence that seemed carved rather than grown, composed but shadowed by an unspoken distance. When Julian extended his hand, Ethan found himself observing the man's steady gaze more than the handshake itself. Julian's eyes were quiet, too quiet, Ethan thought, as if he was always evaluating something just beyond the surface. The first half hour passed in a comfortable but measured rhythm. Madison and Rowan carried most of the conversation, catching up about work, mutual friends, and Madison's latest attempt at cultivating indoor plants. Ethan listened more than he spoke, occasionally contributing a brief comment or question. Each time he did, he could feel Julian's attention shift toward him, not dramatically, but consistently, as though Julian was piecing together small details from every word Ethan offered that it wasn't flirting. Not obviously, anyway. But there was a careful attentiveness in Julian's manner, something contemplative. Ethan tried to ignore it, reminding himself Julian was married to Rowan, his sister's friend, a woman who clearly cared for him deeply. Still, the subtle interactions unsettled him, not because they were inappropriate, but because they revealed how perceptive Julian truly was. Ethan was used to going unnoticed in social settings. Julian seemed immune to overlooking anything. Rowan invited them to sit for dinner, and the four of them gathered around a modest but elegantly arranged table. Conversation shifted to upcoming plans, favorite travel memories, and a playful debate about which city had the best coffee. Madison animatedly argued for Portland, while Rowan defended Seattle with the confidence of someone who had lived there long enough to form a strong opinion. Ethan found himself smiling more than expected, lulled by the ease of the evening. At moments, though, he caught Julian watching him, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that made Ethan aware of every small movement he made. When their eyes met, Julian would offer a polite smile before returning to whatever topic was being discussed. The gesture was subtle, thoughtful even, yet it stirred a quiet tension under Ethan's calm exterior. He told himself it was simple curiosity. They were strangers, after all. People studied strangers. After dinner, Rowan guided Madison into the living room to show her something, an art piece, perhaps. Ethan didn't fully catch the explanation. That left Ethan alone in the dining room as he gathered plates, intending to help carry them to the kitchen. Julian stepped forward at the same time, reaching for the same dish. Their hands brushed lightly, an unplanned contact that sent a strange wave of awareness up Ethan's arm. "Sorry," Ethan murmured quickly. "No need," Julian replied, voice low and even. "Thank you for helping. Rowan appreciates guests who don't disappear after dinner." Ethan nodded, unsure what to say. He followed Julian into the kitchen, where the soft under-cabinet lights cast warm reflections across the counter. The moment felt ordinary enough, yet the silence between them settled differently than the earlier group conversation. It wasn't awkward, but charged with something unspoken. Julian washed while Ethan dried. A simple routine, but the quiet allowed Ethan to observe Julian more closely, the precision in his movements, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his thoughts seemed to drift even as he focused on the task. Julian wasn't unfriendly. He was careful. Contained. "You're quieter than Madison," Julian said eventually, handing Ethan another plate. "She'd say I've always been that way," Ethan replied. I'm better at listening than talking. Nothing wrong with that, Julian said. People say more when someone else actually listens. The words hung between them for a moment. Ethan didn't comment, though part of him wanted to. The tone in Julian's voice, soft, reflective, suggested he wasn't referring to casual conversation. But before Ethan could form a response, Rowan's laughter drifted from the living room, pulling Julian gently back into his composed demeanor. They finished the dishes and rejoined the others, though Ethan felt different now, more aware of the room, more conscious of Julian's presence somewhere behind him. Madison was relaxed, engaged in conversation that needed no assistance from Ethan. Rowan seemed genuinely happy, though her earlier heaviness hadn't disappeared entirely. Julian stood beside her, but his posture and expression suggested a man fulfilling a role rather than sharing joy.as. The evening wound down. Madison thanked Rowan for the dinner, and Ethan followed with a sincere appreciation of his own. Rowan hugged both siblings warmly before stepping back. Julian offered a courteous handshake to Ethan again, though this one carried a quiet sincerity that lingered even after they left the house. Outside, the air was colder, the night sky clear and expansive. Madison chatted beside him about Rowan's art collection and the next time they might visit. Ethan answered when needed, but his mind lingered on the small, delicate moments, fleeting yet heavy with something he didn't want to define that he told himself it was nothing. A strange atmosphere, a thoughtful host, and an evening that felt more layered than expected. Still, as they walked to the car, Ethan wondered why Julian's final glance had felt like the beginning of a question rather than the end of a night. The following weeks unfolded quietly, as if the apartment itself held its breath. What had once felt like polite distance between Lucas and me began to soften into something warmer, something unspoken but persistent. The morning silences at the coffee maker turned into conversations that lingered too long. He'd ask about my day before it even began, and I found myself wanting to answer that we developed a rhythm that felt natural, too natural. He cooked dinner most nights, and I cleaned up afterward. Sometimes he'd stay in the kitchen with me, leaning against the counter, sleeves rolled up, voice low and unhurried. He'd tell small stories about his past, a childhood in Oregon, a brother he hadn't spoken to in years, a dream of one day owning a small cafe by the coast. His stories carried a melancholy that mirrored my own. One night, as I dried the last plate, I asked without thinking, "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" He smiled faintly, eyes focused on the dark window. "You stop noticing after a while," he said. Then, after a pause, "Until someone reminds you what company feels like." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. But something in his tone lingered, circling my thoughts long after I went to bed. Lucas had a way of filling the space between words with emotion. A brush of his hand, a glance across the room, each one carried more meaning than entire conversations. I told myself it was friendship, the kind of fragile connection two lonely people build to survive. But each day made the lie harder to maintain. It was late one evening when he mentioned Dylan. We were on the balcony, a bottle of red wine between us, the city lights flickering below. "I haven't been completely honest," he said, tracing the rim of his glass with a finger. The air grew still. "I'm still seeing someone. His name's Dylan. We've been together for years, but he travels a lot for work. Things have been complicated." I felt the ground shift under me. "Complicated how?" I asked, though part of me already knew that he sighed. "He's gone most of the time. When he's here, it feels like we're strangers sharing the same house. I guess I didn't realize how lonely I was until you moved in." I looked at him, heart thudding. His confession wasn't shocking, it only confirmed what I'd begun to suspect, but hearing it aloud made it real. It changed the way the air felt between us. "I'm not trying to make things messy," he added quickly, reading the hesitation on my face. "I just needed to tell you." The silence that followed was heavy and alive. I could hear the faint hum of traffic below, the whisper of wind against glass. I wanted to leave, to end the moment before it became something irreversible. But I stayed. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake listening to the faint sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, the closing of his door. My mind replayed his words again and again, each repetition threading guilt through the quiet longing I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I told myself to keep my distance. But distance is a fragile thing when you share walls and mornings. Days later, it was the heater that started it. My room's old radiator broke in the middle of an unusually cold night. I tried to fix it, but the metal hissed and rattled uselessly. Lucas knocked on my door, hair messy from sleep. "You'll freeze in here," he said. "Come stay in my room until it's fixed." I hesitated. "That's not necessary." "It's fine, Ethan," he said softly. "I'll take the couch if it makes you more comfortable." But when I stepped into his room, it was clear he hadn't meant it. The bed was wide enough for two, and the couch barely large enough for one. I told myself it was temporary, just one night that we lay there, a careful space between us, the glow from the streetlight cutting through the blinds. Neither of us spoke. I could hear his breathing, slow and steady, and my own heart, too loud in the quiet. Then, faintly, he whispered, "Do you ever wish things were simpler?" I turned my head. He was looking at me, eyes open in the dark. "Sometimes," I said. "But simple doesn't always mean right." He smiled sadly. "No. It doesn't." The space between us dissolved. His hand found mine under the blanket, hesitant at first, then sure. I didn't pull away. The touch felt inevitable, like gravity, slow, certain, unstoppable. When his lips met mine, the world shrank to the quiet pulse of breath and heartbeat. It wasn't rushed, not desperate, just two people stepping across a line they'd been pretending not to see. For a moment, everything felt right in the wrong way. Later, I lay awake, watching the faint light spill across his face. He looked peaceful, younger somehow. But guilt crept in, cold and certain. I had promised myself I wouldn't become part of someone else's betrayal, yet here I was, tracing the same painful outline. At dawn, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. The apartment was hushed, the kind of stillness that follows after something irreversible. I made coffee, hands trembling slightly, and stared out the window as the sky turned pale. When Lucas entered the kitchen, he didn't speak. He just placed a hand on my shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of what we both already knew. His touch was warm, but it burned with consequence. He finally said, "Dylan's coming back this weekend." I froze. The words landed heavy. "Does he know?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. And I don't know what to do." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The coffee steamed between us, untouched. "I shouldn't have," I began, but he cut me off gently. "Don't," he said. "Last night was real. Even if it was wrong." I wanted to believe him, but the truth pressed hard against my chest. Real didn't make it right. The rest of the day passed like a half-remembered dream. I went through the motions, work, chores, quiet meals, but the air between us had changed. Every look, every word carried the weight of something forbidden. That night, as Lucas slept beside me again, I stared at the ceiling. I could feel the warmth of him, close enough to touch, close enough to destroy. I told myself I could stop it here, that this would be the last night, the last secret. But as his hand brushed mine in sleep, the lie settled heavy and familiar in my chest. I turned toward him, watching the faint rhythm of his breath. He looked calm, content. I envied that peace. I whispered to the dark. I told myself it was love. The words barely left my lips before the truth followed, silent but undeniable. It already felt like a secret. The morning after the storm was unnervingly still. The mountains wore a fresh layer of mist, and the air outside the cabin smelled clean, too clean, as though the night before had been washed away. Ethan woke to silence, broken only by the slow crackle of new firewood and the faint sound of water dripping from the roof. His head felt heavy, not from wine, but from everything that had gone unsaid. Caleb stood by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost casual, but something beneath it had changed. His voice when he spoke was soft, careful. "You sleep at all?" Ethan shook his head. "Barely." Caleb handed him a mug. "Yeah. Me neither." They sat across from each other, separated by the narrow table that suddenly felt like a chasm. The quiet wasn't comfortable this time. It was thick, weighted with what they hadn't done but almost had. Ethan stared into his cup, the rising steam blurring his reflection. He wanted to say something, apologize, explain, retreat, but no words fit. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "We should probably head back before the road's ice over." Ethan nodded, grateful for the practicality of the statement. "Yeah. Let's do that." They packed in silence. Every small sound, the zip of a bag, the creak of the floorboards, the closing of drawers, felt exaggerated, like punctuation in a conversation neither wanted to finish. When Caleb brushed past him to grab his jacket, Ethan's heart jumped despite himself. The nearness hurt more than the distance ever could. Before leaving, Ethan stepped outside for air. The sky was pale, the valley below hidden under slow-moving fog. He closed his eyes, letting the cold bite at his skin. He told himself this would fade, that time and reason would erase the sharpness of what had almost happened. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. Some moments refused to dissolve. Caleb came out behind him. "You ready?" Ethan nodded without turning around. "Yeah." The drive down the mountain was quiet. The winding roads felt endless, and each curve brought a new kind of tension, the kind that comes from knowing silence is safer than truth. Caleb focused on the road, his jaw tight, knuckles pale against the steering wheel. Ethan watched the landscape blur past, trees melting into shades of gray and green. He wanted to say something that could make the air lighter, but everything that came to mind felt dishonest. Halfway down, Caleb finally spoke. "You don't have to hate me for last night." Ethan turned to him. "I don't." Caleb's eyes stayed on the road. "Then what do you feel?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Confused. Guilty. Maybe both." "About me?" "About everything." Caleb gave a faint nod, almost to himself. "I didn't plan it, you know." "I know." Ethan paused. "That doesn't make it easier." They drove the rest of the way in silence. By the time they reached the highway, the sun had climbed above the trees, melting what little snow remained. The world looked ordinary again, and that felt like a lie. When Caleb dropped him off at his apartment, he didn't kill the engine. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't move to leave. For a long moment, they sat in stillness. Caleb broke it first. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "You too." He stepped out, closed the door, and stood on the curb as the truck pulled away. The sound of its tires faded into city noise until it was gone entirely. For the first time in days, Ethan felt utterly alone. Inside, Ryan was home early. He looked up from the couch, smiling with that easy familiarity Ethan had always found comforting. "Hey, you're back sooner than I thought. How was it?" Ethan managed a smile. "Peaceful." Ryan stood, stretching, then crossed over to hug him. "You needed it." Ethan let himself be held, but it felt strange, like fitting into a shape that no longer matched perfectly. Ryan smelled like coffee and cedar soap, the same as always. Nothing had changed here, and that was the problem. As the evening went on, Ryan talked about work, about a project deadline, about weekend plans. Ethan listened, nodding at the right moments, pretending everything was fine. But part of him still lingered in that cabin, by the fire, in the sound of rain, in Caleb's voice whispering truths neither could bear to hold. Later that night, while Ryan slept, Ethan sat by the window with his phone. One unread message glowed on the screen. "Caleb, I didn't plan it. But I don't regret feeling something real." Ethan's thumb hovered over the delete button. He didn't reply. Instead, he locked the screen and set the phone face down. But the word stayed, echoing like a heartbeat. He stared out at the city lights scattered across the dark. It was strange how easily life resumed, how routine could disguise turmoil. Yet inside, a quiet storm still moved. Guilt pressed at him, but beneath it lay something harder to name, a longing not for what happened, but for what it revealed that he wondered what it said about him, that a single weekend could shake years of certainty. That a glance, a touch, a near mistake could make him question what he thought he knew about love and loyalty. By midnight, the room had gone completely still. Ryan shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Ethan watched him, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the trust in his unguarded face. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between them, but couldn't. The space felt sacred now, something he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. When dawn approached, pale and thin, Ethan still hadn't slept. He went to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood by the window as the first light touched the skyline. His reflection looked older, quieter, changed in ways no one would notice. That he thought of the mountains, of how they seemed eternal from afar, but up close, every surface told a story of erosion, of weather, of time reshaping even the strongest stone. Maybe people weren't so different. Caleb would fade, he told himself. The memory would dull, the guilt would soften. But part of him knew better. Some stories don't end, they just become quieter versions of themselves, hidden in the folds of ordinary life. Ethan took a slow breath and whispered to the empty room, "The mountains keep secrets." Then, almost to himself, softer still, "So do I." He set the mug down, straightened his posture, and turned toward the day waiting for him, but as the sunlight broke across the room, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted for good, and that the silence he carried from that cabin would follow him long after everything else had been forgotten.